Evo Japan was this past weekend, and from what I saw, it was a really good time. I enjoyed the competition, but one of my favorite things about any event is the potential game announcements. Evo Japan gave us a first look at Hunter x Hunter Nin Impact, Marco Rodriguez being revealed in City of Wolves, Liddy returning to Tekken 8, and we got our first look at Akuma in Street Fighter 6. Everything was lit until someone upped the sniper scope on the Evo streams and they went, "Oh!" With the streams being taken down, I now had some free time, and all that free time allowed me to sit back and wonder what other fighting games I'm fond of. Specifically, fighting games that have been forgotten to time. Dear game developers, you guys are sleeping on a gold mine by ignoring some of these forgotten franchises. Fighting games are in something of a renaissance at the moment thanks to the success of titles like Street Fighter 6 and Tekken 8. Fighting games have been notorious for being hard to dive deep into, but things have changed since they've made some modern changes. Things such as complex controls, terrible netcode, and limited content are all out the window, unless your name is Mortal Kombat 1. But other than that, all these things have changed, and the FGC has more eyes on it than ever. And a wise man once said, you need to strike while the iron is hot. So I'm about to take you on a wild trip down memory lane and show you some of the dopest fighting games that were lost to time and should attempt to make a comeback. Trust me, these games were doing some wild, innovative stuff for their time, and there's room for them to innovate again. You might just be surprised at what you've been missing out on, so I'd like to welcome you to Fighting Games That Should Return!
Here comes a new challenger!
One of the quirkiest fighting games ever made is Clay Fighter 63 1/3. I remember the first time I saw this game at my after-school YMCA, and I thought to myself, what the hell is this? It looked like something took a bunch of Play-Doh and turned it into a video game, but you know what? It was different, and it worked. See, most fighting games back then were all about realistic graphics and serious characters, and those games didn't age well because of it. Clay Fighter said, fuck that noise, and they went in a totally different direction. They used stop-motion claymation to create this goofy world filled with these parody characters. Like, you had Mr. Frosty, who was basically a badass version of Frosty the Snowman, and then you had Earthworm Jim, a worm in a spacesuit from another classic series on the Super Nintendo. But it wasn't just the character designs that were hilarious. The whole game was filled with stupid jokes and puns. Characters would spout off these cheesy one-liners that would make you cringe and laugh at the same time. Like, even the combo system was a joke. If you did a simple 3-hit combo, someone would shout, "Itty bitty combo!" And sometimes the announcer would shout random stuff like, "Little girly combo!" One of my favorite things about the game is when you would land a heavy hit, you'd send your opponent flying into another room. The stages were made up of multiple rooms that you could knock each other into, so one moment you're fighting in the living room, and the next you're duking it out in the kitchen. It felt like this fucked up version of MTV Cribs. Instead of finishers, this game had what was called claytalities. Those were this game's version of fatalities, but instead of being all gory and serious, they were just ridiculous and over the top. Like, one character would turn into a giant blob and eat the other guy, another would summon a bunch of tiny versions of himself to beat everyone up. This game truly embraced its over-the-top nature, and it was better for it. But you know, as silly as Clay Fighters was, it actually had some pretty solid fighting mechanics. They even added stuff like double jumping and air dashing in the remastered version of the game. Plus, it had a 3-level super combo, kind of similar to Street Fighter Alpha, so it wasn't just a gimmick. There was some real depth to the gameplay. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Clay Fighters was a game that didn't take itself too seriously, and this is what made it so great. It was the class clown of fighting games, always cracking jokes and doing dumb shit to make you laugh, but underneath all the silliness was a genuinely fun and unique fighter that deserves way more love than it gets.
Here comes a new challenger!
Speaking of unique fighters, have you heard of Bloody Roar? Because that game was my childhood. In Bloody Roar, every character had a human form and a beast form, and you could switch between them whenever you wanted. It was like 1 second you were playing as this normal looking dude, and the next you were a giant naked mole rat that would put Kim Possible's Rufus to shame. But here's the thing, the beast forms weren't just for show, they actually had their own unique movesets and abilities. So when you transformed, it was like playing a whole new character. Each beast had its own strengths and weaknesses, so you really had to think about when to use them in the fight. Oh, and get this, the more damage you took in the human form, the more your beast meter would fill up, and when you finally transformed, some of that health would regenerate. So it was like, oh, you think you winning? Boom, now I'm an almighty werewolf with a full health bar ready to tear that ass up. But you know what I really loved about Bloody Roar? The controls were simple. This was a much more accessible fighter geared towards having fun, which in turn makes me think it would fare well with today's audience, seeing as it was ahead of its time with its modern controls. It had none of those complicated button combos that make you feel like you're doing Naruto jutsu signs. In Bloody Roar, before, it was just punch, kick, and beast mode. Even the simplest of minds were capable of having a good time. But don't get it twisted though. Just because the controls were easy doesn't mean the game was a cakewalk. There was still plenty of room for skill and strategy. See, you could cancel your normal attacks into command moves and vice versa to create these crazy combos. And the game had all these defensive moves called scratch techniques that let you counter attacks from different angles, so you really had to outthink your opponent if you wanted to win. It just blows my mind that somehow this simple fighter from back in the day had more defensive tools than Tekken 8.
That's rude.
The character design in this game was immaculate. It tapped into the imagination of every 90s kid on the playground. You had your standard martial arts types, but you also had stuff like a rabbit girl, a mole man, lions, tigers, and more, and each one had their unique fighting style that kept combat fresh. I remember being a kid playing as Yugo the wolf guy, and anytime my back was against the wall feeling that pressure, I'd activate his beast mode and just explode with power to push back my opponent. It always felt like you were going Super Saiyan if you timed it correctly, which would put your opponent on their heels. It was the fact your beast form had its own separate health bar that added depth, so you couldn't just stay in beast mode forever, and you had to make your hits count before the meter would run out and you would revert back to your human form. It was like this constant back and forth trying to outmaneuver your opponent and find the right time to strike.
Here comes a new challenger!
Now, if you're familiar with my content, you know Soul Calibur holds a special place in my heart. It's my personal favorite fighting game franchise of all time, but as of recently, it feels like Bandai Namco just doesn't care about this beloved franchise. I mean, the last entry in the series was a free-to-play single-player fighting game called Soul Calibur Lost Swords that nobody asked for. It was a lazy cash grab that ironically lacked any caliber of soul. Before that, Soul Calibur was something special. What made it stand out is its combat's focus on weapons instead of martial arts. You had standout characters like the speedy Maxie and his nunchucks, the sultry Ivy and her chainsword, the weird spinning Voldo, the bouncy Taki, and if you were a bitch, you played Keelik and his OP bow staff.
You're projecting. Drop it.
One of my favorite things about Soul Calibur is what's referred to as their 8-way run system. Listen, if you hate movement in Tekken 8, you would love Soul Calibur. Sidestepping really mattered in this game alongside footsies because one wrong timing and you were getting severely punished the way this game moved. And the punishment looked great in the process. That's because Soul Calibur was one of the best looking fighters on the market whenever a new one dropped. Character models looked great, stages would take damage, and the use of motion capture was the reason why animations in this game were so fluid even till this day. Soul Calibur also did something that I've never seen before. I'm not saying this was the first game to do it, but it certainly feels like this was the series that made the move popular. I'm talking about the addition of guest characters. Every entry in the mainline series from the second game on launched with guest characters, and the cool thing is those guest characters were exclusive to the platform they were on. I remember they had Hachi on the PS2, Link on the GameCube, Spawn on the Xbox, Ezio was everywhere, Kratos was on the PSP, there was Starkiller, Darth Vader, and if you were a bitch, you played Yoda on the 360.
It's back!
You know, jokes aside, Soul Calibur may be my favorite fighting game of all time, but I can also acknowledge implementing Yoda into the 360 version of Soul Calibur 4 was the worst idea known to man. If you've never played this game, just know Yoda in that game was arguably one of the worst characters to ever exist in a fighting game due to his tiny hitbox. If you played the game, feel free to back me up in the comment section, share your horror stories. Every time I would run into a Yoda online, I would shout. Now, what this franchise did get right is its customization. Bandai Namco also publishes Tekken 8, which I often hear praised for its custom characters, but I'm telling you, that's just a watered down Soul Calibur in the customization department. You can make damn near anything in Soul Calibur. I recall making Dr. Doom, Gambit, Iron Man, and more, and it was fun to just sit in the menus and go crazy with the customization. I don't know why Bandai Namco doesn't care about this franchise anymore, but I think with the right amount of TLC, it can make a strong return. Just give us a strong netcode, decent story, character customization, new mechanics, and new characters, and we're good. Just like my next game.
Here comes a new challenger!
DarkStalkers is a fighting game that was seriously lost to time. It has a cult-like following, but it never managed to quite crack the mainstream. It's to the point where most people can only name 2 characters from this series, and the ones y'all do know, most of y'all probably think they originated from Marvel vs. Capcom or Super Puzzle Fighters. I'm specifically talking about Morgan and Felicia, aka every horny boy's favorite cosplay. Those characters are from DarkStalkers, and DarkStalkers had some great gameplay. They had this thing called chain combos where you could link together a bunch of combo attacks into one big combo, and this game also supported a super meter that allowed you to unleash flashy and powerful moves that were unique to this franchise, seeing as this was vampire themed. DarkStalkers also featured something called the Dark Force mechanic. In Darkstalkers Revenge, characters could transform into these powered up versions of themselves with crazy new abilities. And just like Bloody Roar, it made the player feel like they were going Super Saiyan, but instead with monsters. But you know what I really loved about this franchise? It was the stages. I mean, man, it was the little details that made them feel alive. For an older game, it still looks great to this day, and it's because of the use of vibrant colors and the constant activity in the background of each stage that made things feel more immersive. But you know, as cool as Darkstalkers was, it never quite reached the mainstream success of other fighting games. I think it was because it was just a little bit too out there for some people. I mean, the game was full of vampires, werewolves, and mummies, so it might have creeped some people out, but for the people who got it, they got it. See, Darkstalkers had such a unique style and personality that set it apart from everything else on the market at the time, and the gameplay was solid. I would love to see Capcom give this franchise another shot, and I'm sure all the horny boys would too.
Here comes a new challenger!
Now, of all the games mentioned today, I believe Virtua Fighter is most likely to return outside of maybe Soul Calibur, and that's because Virtua Fighter is the OG of 3D fighters. Without this game, Tekken wouldn't exist. Matter of fact, the first two Tekken games were straight up Virtua Fighter clones. Tekken didn't really become Tekken until Tekken 3. I remember putting a lot of hours into Virtua Fighter in the arcades when I was a kid. See, back in the day, every fighting game was using 2D sprites. You had your Street Fighters and your Mortal Kombats, plus every other game trying to clone those two. But then Sega came out of nowhere with Virtua Fighter in 1993, and as Drake would say, nothing was the same. Virtua Fighter was the first fighting game to use 3D polygon graphics for its characters, and although it looks terrible now, it was mind-blowing back in the 1990s. Entering that third dimension allowed this franchise to set itself apart from the other fighting games on the market. But it wasn't just the graphics that made Virtua Fighter so good, the gameplay was very technical. Like, go back and play the last entry in the series, Virtua Fighter 5, to see what I'm talking about. You couldn't just mash buttons and expect to win. You had to really know your timing, spacing, and your buttons. The fact Virtua Fighter was played at Evo 2023 speaks volumes to the level of depth this game has and the love the players share for it. Mind you, Virtua Fighter 5 was the last entry in the series, and it was released back in 2006 for the Xbox 360 and the PS3. Now, there was a re-released version called Ultimate Showdown with some spruced up visuals, all the content and quality of life changes, but that doesn't change the fact this is an 18-year-old game at its core. This game is old enough to vote. Virtua Fighter was fun because it was one of the first games I recall where you could actually knock your opponent into the walls of the stage, and if you did it right, you could combo them for massive damage. This added a whole new layer of strategy to the game that many games are still mimicking to this day. And from my research, this is one of the first online fighters that had a ranked mode. All these features that I'm listing in this game are standard nowadays in every other fighting game, but the reason I think they should return is because Sega clearly has foresight. I'm confident they can find a way to bring something new and innovative to the fighting genre, seeing as that is their track record. Once again, the last game was released in 2006. I know they got some new ideas they can implement into this series, and the good news is that rumors have been circulating that Sega is working on a Virtua Fighter 6. Now, nothing is confirmed at the time of this recording, but hopefully these rumors turn out to be true. They need to stop pimping out Sonic and find another source of revenue, and I think the FGC can be that for them. Now, since this video is getting a little long in the tooth, for the next portion of this video, I'm gonna speed run some games I'd like to see return, so hang on to your britches. The first game I'd like to mention is Naruto Clash of Ninja. Anime fans who are also gamers are sick and tired of 3D arena fighters like Ultimate Ninja Storm and Jump Force, where you basically just mash the B button to win. I would love to see the Clash of Ninja series return with some more depth, or maybe even a Naruto Fighters made by Atlas. The second game I want to mention is Killer Instinct. That game needs to come back. I used to love this series on the Super Nintendo and N64. The reboot on Xbox One was solid, but it never stood a chance after Microsoft botched the launch of that platform. At the time, there was an executive working for Microsoft named Don Matrick, and he was on record saying, if you don't have an internet connection, then don't buy an Xbox One.
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
So stick with 360, that's your message if you don't,
like it? If you have zero access to the internet, that is an offline device.
They have a platform for you. It's called the Xbox 360. It was all downhill after that. It's a shame too, because Killer Instinct on the Xbox One was fast-paced, the combos were disrespectful, it was free free to play, and it gave us this classic quote.
In the Ultra!
The third fighting game I want to highlight is called Power Stone. Not your traditional fighter, more of a party brawler, but this was an awesome game lost to time. This game revolved around collecting power stones on the map, which unlocked powerful transformations to give you an advantage over your opponent. It was one of the first 4-player fighting games with a 3D arena, which was unique to the genre, and this was a really fun game to run with friends. I could see this prospering in today's gaming space with online play and more content. The fourth fighting game I want to highlight is a game called Super Puzzle Fighter. Once again, not your traditional fighting game. It's a match 3 puzzle game starring Capcom characters from various franchises. Every time you match puzzle pieces together correctly, the character you selected would do one of their iconic attacks like Ryu's Hadouken. The goal was to drop your opponent's health bar to 0 through match 3s and attacks before they dropped yours. This is a criminally underrated puzzle fighting game that I think would eat well in today's mobile market. Put it on iOS and Android, add a short story mode and online play, and boom, Capcom is printing cash. The fifth fighting game I want to highlight that needs to come back is Dead or Alive because, you know, ass and titties. And the sixth fighting game I want to highlight is called X-Men Mutant Academy. Honestly, there wasn't much unique about this fighting game, but it did sell well enough to get a sequel, so why not bring it back? It was just a fighting game that featured the X-Men and it wasn't half bad. I love the X-Men, so why not take another crack at it? If that doesn't interest Marvel, then maybe try a fighter with all of the Marvel cast so they don't feel limited. This is just my inner child speaking, so I doubt this will happen, but what we do know is happening is a new hero shooter starring Marvel characters is on the way. It's called Marvel Rivals, and some people are calling it the Overwatch killer. Click the card on the screen right now to find out why.